Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming, and welcome to this exciting and stimulating evening, a chance to hear one of our nation's leading public officials, one of the people who works day and night to keep us safe, give us some perspective on the anniversary that's approaching. An anniversary where the events, of course, as we all know, took place just a mile south of here. I am Michael Waldman. I'm the Executive Director of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We're delighted to partner with the law school to co-sponsor this event. I want to quickly thank some of my colleagues who made this event happen and who do so much for our work. Kyle Allagood, Eric Opsahl, Janine Plant-Churlin, Faiza Patel, and Liza Goitin of our Liberty and National Security program. Thank you for doing this and for all you do. And I want to emphasize that the program of which they are a part, our Liberty and National Security program, is called that for a reason. It's the Liberty and National Security, not the Liberty or National Security program. We believe very strongly that we can protect our country and protect our safety and our people and protect our values and our Constitution. We appreciate very much that Secretary Napolitano, throughout her career, has demonstrated her loyalty to those same values, to that same difficult but utterly necessary balancing act that we as Americans have to go through. The Brennan Center, for those of you who don't know, is a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We're part think tank, part public interest law firm, and part advocacy group. We work on issues including voting rights, access to the courts for the poor, and campaign finance. And in fact, one of the ways we're most pleased to welcome Secretary Napolitano is that we had the chance to work with her in the past. I was lucky enough to know Secretary Napolitano when she was Governor Napolitano of Arizona, and I was in private practice. And then at the Brennan Center, we were very pleased to welcome her as the first living Constitution lecturer a few years ago, where she talked about Arizona's public campaign financing system, the Clean Elections Law of Arizona. And she was reminding us just now, when she met with the Brennan Center staff upstairs, that she was the first publicly financed governor in the country. And as many of you know, we are representing the Clean Elections Institute of Arizona. We're actually representing Arizona in the U.S. Supreme Court in a case that could come down any day, trying to defend the constitutionality of that statute. We believe that voluntary public financing, like so many other campaign reforms, are constitutional, have always been constitutional, and are necessary for a self-governing democracy. We're very honored to have helped defend that law, which we hope we'll hear in a few days, and we hope, knock on a wooden podium, we will have some success. But you'll hear that Secretary Napolitano is smart and thoughtful and tough and funny. Not that, I don't know that the terrorists care about funny, but we appreciate it. And to introduce her, I'm very pleased to present to you the Dean of NYU School of Law, and just recently entering his 10th year as Dean of this incredible institution, a member of the Brennan Center Board of Directors, and we're very delighted to have him, and also to welcome Dan Kolb, another Brennan Center board member who's here, a leader of our organization, and the Dean of this law school, Ricky Revesz.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome. It's terrific to partner with the Brennan Center on this project and so many others. The Brennan Center has done terrific work here and has brought our students and faculty together in its substantive programs, and we feel so good about this partnership. And of course, Brennan Center has a great leader who received great legal training here at the law school, and so I want to thank Michael Waldman, law school class of 1987. So the attacks of September 11, 2001 were transformative for so many people and institutions in our country, and NYU Law School was no exception. In 2003, we created our Center for Law and Security in response to the changes that were taking place in the wake of the attacks, and it quickly became one of the leading institutions where policymakers, scholars, lawyers, government officials, and journalists gathered to study the major legal, security, and foreign policy issues in the post-9/11 environment that we live in. The Brennan Center also responded by expanding its mission. It was already at the time a leading voice on important issues such as voting rights and elections, campaign finance, and racial justice, and at the time created its Liberty and National Security Program, aimed at ensuring that our nation's commitment to national security comports with the rule of law and fundamental freedoms. At no time has this mission been more important, and the Brennan Center has done exceptional work in this area. As we near the 10th anniversary of 9/11, we're reminded of the challenges and concerns that are raised nearly every day. Sadly, in this unstable world, we are also regularly reminded that threats to the lives of individuals and security of nations also persist. Osama bin Laden may be gone, but violent extremism and terrorism are not. Thus, the mission of the Department of Homeland Security, which Secretary Napolitano leads, is as important today as it was when it was formed 8 years ago. So on this not too uplifting note, I am delighted to welcome the Honorable Janet Napolitano, the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, to the law school. This is not the first time that she comes here. As Michael mentioned, she gave the inaugural Living Constitutions lecture in 2008. She also sort of was here earlier in 2004. Now, you might wonder what that imprecision refers to. But in 2004, we invited Governor Napolitano to give the annual Attorney General Robert Abrams Public Service Lecture, which is our premier public service lecture named after a great alumnus of the law school, Bob Abrams, who served with great distinction as Attorney General of the state of New York, and were it not for a timing issue, may have got himself elected to the U.S. Senate. Governor Napolitano graciously accepted, and we were very excited. But something got in the way, a hostage situation. Hostages took over one of the state prisons, and that meant that the governor had to cancel the trip to New York, which is completely understandable. What was wonderful is that she appeared here by video and then arranged to answer questions from the audience by speakerphone. And it was a wonderful moment for the law school because the students, it was in this room, it was about the same number of people, understood the gravity of the situation, it was very serious, understood how much pressure the governor must be under, and it was wonderful in real time to be able to have a Q&A session with the governor of Arizona, who was going through this very difficult, who was handling this very difficult situation. Since she was last here, Governor Napolitano became, well, Secretary Napolitano. She's the third person and first woman to lead the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which is the third largest cabinet department after the Department of Defense, and you might not guess what the other one is. It's the Department of Veterans Affairs. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. government created her department in one of the most sweeping reorganizations of the federal government in half a century. Secretary Napolitano is in charge of an organization with a mission ranging from securing the national leaders, the national borders, to protecting against and responding to terrorist threats. Tonight, she is here to discuss a topic that is vastly different from the one she spoke about during her last visit to the Brennan Center, the ongoing evolution of America's homeland security efforts 10 years after the 9/11 attacks, including lessons learned and the continuing efforts to counter violent extremism, combat terrorism, and prepare and respond to the ever-evolving threats that we face. The Secretary was born here in New York and grew up in Pittsburgh and Albuquerque. She graduated from Santa Clara University as the university's first female valedictorian and received her JD from the University of Virginia Law School. Before entering public office, she served as a law clerk to Judge Mary Schroeder of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and practiced law at the distinguished law firm of Lewis and Roca in Phoenix. She was the first woman Attorney General of Arizona and also served as U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona. She was in her second term as governor of Arizona when she was chosen to be the next secretary. and was already recognized as the national leader in Homeland Security, border security, and immigration. She was the first woman to chair the National Governors Association and was named one of the top 5 governors in the country by Time magazine. It is thanks to her collaboration with international allies and law enforcement and her long-time focus on a safe homeland on the state and federal level that Secretary Napolitano has earned the trust of people across the country and across the world. On behalf of the Law School and of the Brennan Center, I am pleased to welcome the Honorable Janet Napolitano for her talk entitled Strength, Security, and Shared Responsibility, Preventing Terrorist Attacks a Decade After 9/11. Welcome, Madam Secretary.
Well, thank you, and it is a pleasure to be back here and back in New York City, back at the Brennan Center and at NYU to talk about where we stand and to talk about some of the issues confronting Homeland Security now almost 10 years after the attack of 9/11. Thank you, Dean, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Michael, for allowing me to come back. Appreciate that. And thank you all for being here this evening. Now, since the beginning of this year, I have been speaking across the country at various universities and colleges about Homeland Security because it is a new and ever-evolving field, and it is one that, as the Dean mentioned, covers a range of topics. If you look at the Department of Homeland Security, as it was created by the Congress after the attacks of 9/11, its responsibilities range from counterterrorism to securing our borders, meaning air, land, and sea, to immigration enforcement, a very non-controversial area, to cybersecurity, which is a fast-growing and area more and more important each day, to disaster response and recovery, whatever the source of the disaster is, a terrorist attack, another man-caused disaster, or indeed Mother Nature. So, for example, right now, we are responding to federally declared disasters in 28 different states, on a remarkable and unfortunately record-setting spring for tornadoes and flooding across our country. So we have a vast and range of responsibilities, but the priority for the department was, is, and will remain the counterterrorism issue. How do we protect the people of the United States from being the victim of an attack again? And how do we do that in a way that respects and embraces our own rights and liberties, values that undergird our country and that we are sworn to as attorneys and as members of the cabinet we are sworn to uphold. So I want to talk with you about that facet of our work, the counterterrorism facet, and I want to speak with you in that vein as a member of the cabinet, not as a student or faculty member or other, but somebody who is dealing with these issues on a day in and day out basis. Because I believe that right now is an opportune time to discuss the ongoing threats that our nation still faces. Because right now we are between two focusing events. One, of course, is the killing of Osama bin Laden, and the other is the upcoming 10-year anniversary of 9/11. What we learned from the Osama bin Laden operation confirms what I think many in this hall knew or suspected for a long time. And that is that Al-Qaeda and its affiliates remain determined to target the West, particularly the United States, both here and through our interests abroad. So as we move forward over the coming months to commemorate what happened on 9/11, and share again the remarkable stories of the men and women who perished in the attacks here in Pentagon and in Pennsylvania. As we detail the progress the country has indeed made over the past years, we have to also recommit ourselves to the notion that, unfortunately, the world that we inhabit is a world, an environment where terrorists exist and where they continue to focus upon the West and on the United States. Now, where are we now in relation to where we stood, say, on 9/11 or shortly before? I am confident in saying that our country is stronger than we were a decade ago. We have indeed bounced back from the worst attacks ever on our soil, and we have made significant progress in many fronts needed to protect ourselves. I think as well that our nation is smarter about the threats that we face and how best to deal with them. We have used this knowledge to make ourselves more resilient, and not just to terrorist attacks, but to threats and disasters of all kinds. And by resilience, I want to pause here a moment. By resilience, what I mean is the capacity to bounce back quickly after a crisis, like we saw at Ground Zero and at the New York Stock Exchange, which reopened just 4 trading days after the attack. Now, with investments that have been made in capacity building across our country, working with first responders, working with state and local authorities, we have seen remarkable abilities at the state and local level to show resilience from, right now, Mother Nature. So when you think about what's going on in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Missouri, the ability to bounce back from those storms has been enhanced in part by the efforts we actually invested in to fight terrorism or to come back from terrorism, but that in fact allow us to respond better, more quickly, more effectively to a disaster, whatever the source. But let me go back to my major point, which is that the threats from terrorism are still here. They're not going away. They're real, and they are rapidly evolving. They demand our vigilance, and they demand our willingness to learn and to adapt. Perhaps at no other time in our recent history, this point between when the attacks of 9/11 occurred and when we will commemorate the 10th anniversary is the time to say that we have to rethink how we deal with terrorism and understand that one of the evolutions we have made is to say that counterterrorism is not just a governmental function. It's not just a federal governmental function. It involves states. It involves local law enforcement. It involves first responders. It involves the private sector. It involves individual citizens. It involves a sense of shared responsibility, that we as a country are all in this together, and that while different parts of us leverage different types of strengths and abilities, the plain fact of the matter is that everyone has a stake in the safety of our people. So as we move forward, we look back on the last 10 years and note, as was noted in the introduction, that I now lead, the third largest department of the federal government. It is part of the largest reorganization of the federal government that has taken place in our nation's history, that we have reoriented not just the agencies within DHS, but also within the Department of Justice and also the FBI toward the prevention of terrorist acts, and that we have invested tremendous energy and resources in our country to assimilate the knowledge we have gained and to use it, and this is a key point, to use what we have learned and to share it to inform and to empower a broader, more inclusive range of people and institutions to become a part of the Homeland Security architecture of our country. So as we move forward, that architecture, that sense of shared responsibility is the guiding philosophy of how we will proceed. Let me turn to the nature of the threats that we are currently facing. Because the terrorist threat confronting the United States right now has evolved significantly over what it was 10 years ago. Today, in addition to the direct threats we continue to face from Al-Qaeda, or core Al-Qaeda as it's known, we also face growing threats from other foreign-based terrorist groups inspired by Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-like ideology. They may have few operational connections to Al-Qaeda, but they certainly are inspired by Al-Qaeda. And indeed, we face a threat environment where violent extremism is neither constrained by international borders nor limited to any single ideology. One of the most striking evolutions we have seen recently, and indeed we've seen this accelerate even during my 2.5 years as the secretary, is that plots to attack the United States increasingly involve U.S. persons, United States persons, American citizens. Based on the latest intelligence and law enforcement actions, we now operate on the assumption that individuals prepared to carry out terrorist attacks may be in the United States now and could carry out acts of violence with little or no warning. So we have been dealing with an increasingly diffuse source of terrorism and an increasingly smaller, smaller methodology of attack. What do I mean by that? The big plot, the big conspiracies that involve years and years and years to develop, to get people in the country, to train them at flight schools, to be able to weaponize commercial air carriers. Those kinds of plots are not the kinds of plots we see now. What we see now are more diffuse, smaller, quicker to happen. They can involve a single person, and of course, as we know, it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to stop a single person if there is no one with whom that person is communicating, sharing information, plans, or thoughts, because there's nothing at that point to interrupt until something actually occurs. And so, as we move forward, we believe that the increasingly savvy use of the internet, mainstream and social media, and information technology by groups like Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-related groups to inspire those who either live abroad or who actually live in our country now has added an additional layer of complexity to the problem of terrorism that existed prior to 9/11. And we should be very clear that now there is no single portrait of a would-be terrorist. Research and experience has shown that an individual or group's ethnic, religious, or cultural background does not explain why a small number of individuals choose to take their radical beliefs down a violent path. So we have no interest in policing beliefs or in profiling of any sort based on factors like religion or ethnicity. Why? Because not only are those practices illegal, they're also ineffective. That's why we need to be instead working with a broad range of partners to gain a better understanding of the behaviors, the tactics, the techniques, the other indicators that could point to anticipated terrorist activity and the best ways to mitigate or prevent that activity from being successful. If you think about the nature of the evolving threat, what has changed, what we need to be focused upon in our efforts to prevent something from being successful, that bears with it then some implications. The fact that new kinds of threats can come from any direction and with little warning upends much of our thinking about terrorism prevention. And that thinking then has changed not just from a decade ago, but even from a few years ago. It doesn't mean that we still don't need a strong military or top-notch intelligence operation, the very kind that was used to kill bin Laden. Nor does it mean that we focus only on the domestic. Indeed, there is an absolutely international aspect to much of what we do in Homeland Security. Because when we look at the tactics and techniques that could be used to wage an attack, we have to be thinking about aviation. You might not be able to weaponize a plane the way they did on 9/11, but what about smuggling PETN in your underwear onto a plane when you board it in Nigeria and change planes in Amsterdam and fly over Canadian airspace to get to the United States? So aviation, supply chain security. I was speaking about that earlier today. What do I mean by that? I mean the movement of goods and commerce around the world oftentimes is a possible avenue for attack. Witness, for example, the attempted toner cartridge bombs out of Yemen just this past October. Also international in nature. Information sharing about terrorism, human trafficking, science and technology, the things that we are learning to better find, detect, sense, mitigate against possible attacks, all have an international dimension to them. So as we talk about the evolving threat, one of the implications for our nature is to recognize that even when you have something called the Department of Homeland Security, it's actually international in context. We are currently working in 75 countries. We have the third largest international footprint of any federal department. I've traveled in my 2.5 years as secretary to 20 countries, several of them multiple times. So what we do need to do is recognize that with the ever-evolving nature of the threats confronting us, we have to get to a place where every part of our society is cognizant of the kinds of threats that are out there and empowered to take some common sense steps to help counter them. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we try to reduce some of what I've just spoken about to a short phrase. The short phrase that I want you to walk out of here with, there are going to be two. This is the first one. And the first one is that Homeland Security begins with hometown security. That all of us are now stakeholders in the effort to keep families and communities our businesses, our social networks, our places of worship secure and resilient. So what does that mean? It means we have to have a distributed sense about Homeland Security. And how does that take effect? What are some of the indicators of that? Well, there are 4 key parts of that distributed architecture. One, we now have 72 fusion centers throughout the United States. A fusion center is a place where local, state, federal, occasionally tribal and territorial, depending on where you are co-located so that information can be gathered, analyzed, and shared at the local level and looked at through the prism of all of the eyes and ears that state and local law enforcement possess. Second, we've greatly expanded something called the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative, or SAR. SAR is an initiative that trains state and local law enforcement to recognize behaviors and indicators related to terrorism and other threats, and standardizes how those observations are documented, analyzed, and shared back to the Department of Homeland Security, back to the FBI, and shared at that point then can be taken and converted into products that can be reshared throughout the rest of the United States, so that from an intel sharing side, we're not just talking about intel moving from DC to the country, we're now talking about the analytic capacity to bring intelligence from the rest of the country back into Washington, DC. Third aspect of how we are empowering people is the launch of the new National Terrorism Advisory System, which we just recently did in April, the NTAS. The NTAS is the replacement for the old color code system. Say goodbye to orange. We are not using that system anymore. Why? Because it didn't give people information. It didn't give businesses or the private sector information. It didn't give state and local law enforcement information. You know, if you walked into an airport, airports have been at the level orange, I think, since the year 2006. And so rather than have a color code system that nobody paid attention to, except maybe Jay Leno or David Letterman, but instead of that, to have a system where we presume that the base level of risk to our country now incorporates ongoing risk. So our base level is higher than it was prior to 9/11. So we assume that in our base level. And then if there is specific or credible information about a threat, that base level can be elevated or in certain circumstances described as imminent. And when we do that, that warning can be limited by geography, could be limited by sector, could be limited in any number of ways. And importantly, under the system, any warning given expires on its own after 2 weeks, unless the review of the intelligence suggests that it needs to be continued. That's important for a very practical reason, which is once somebody raises a threat level, it is very difficult to take an intentional act to bring it down. So what you have then is just an ever-increasing pile of levels, and people don't pay attention anymore. So the whole idea is to have a system that communicates information, that people pay attention to, and that is relevant to people's real-time situations. And finally, the fourth element of the kind of the shared responsibility aspect of things is the if you see something, say something campaign. I told you that Homeland Security begins with hometown security was one phrase I wanted you to remember. See something, say something will be the second phrase that I want you to walk out of here and to remember. It's a simple and effective public awareness program. It actually began here in New York with the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and the whole purpose is so that people will be alert, not alarmed. And so they know that if they see something untoward, unusual, that they should report it to the appropriate authorities so it can be dealt with. We've seen very good response to see something, say something, and we've expanded it to federal buildings across the United States, to major transit systems like Amtrak, to sports and entertainment venues. So we often have to think about the so-called soft targets to the hotel industry. So when you add those four together, the fusion centers, SARS, the new warning system, see something, say something, each of these four elements learn from and build on each other. And they help us in any number of ways. So to carry them out, we have trained nearly 50,000 law enforcement personnel on SARS. We have worked with hundreds of communities and local organizations on how to incorporate lessons learned. We have implemented lots of new training, and we are doing all of this and at the same time incorporating in everything we do, and I think it's important to say it again, the importance of protecting privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. Because as Michael said in the first intro of the introducer to me, this is there's a false dichotomy if you have to say that we have to sacrifice liberty for security. We don't. We just have to think about them at the same time and look for common sense and pragmatic ways to make sure that both are being pursued. Now, as we have worked across the country, I think we've become not just stronger, I think we've become a bit smarter. We learn from every incident. We learn from what has been done in different states, different locales. The New York State Intel Center in Albany is a good example. The new Vigilance project is another, an analytic and historic catalog of terrorism cases since 9/11, which we can now share across the country. We know that we have now better equipped our states and localities around the United States, and we know that we are beginning to hear some of the things I've been saying echoed back to us. Always a sign that the message is being received. Now, let me, if I might, talk about shared responsibility from an individual standpoint. We have continually recognized the role the public plays. According to one recent outside analysis, from 1999 through 2010, there were a total of 74 plots properly characterized as terrorists, and I realize there are definitional issues there, but in this study, properly characterized as terrorists, there were a total of 74 plots foiled. They were motivated by a variety of ideologies, Al-Qaeda type affiliates representing about half. But what is most critical to note, and does not get the attention it deserves, is that the public, individual members of the public, stopped 1/3 of those plots. In other words, the kind of vigilance we are encouraging through something like the See Something, Say Something campaign has already helped save lives, protect property, help thwart plots in nearly 3 of 10 discovered since 1999. And when you add the fact that federal, state, and local law enforcement, in terms of the other remaining plots, came from old-fashioned shoe leather, old-fashioned police work, and community-oriented policing, and knowing neighborhoods, and knowing what makes sense and what doesn't. Those two things combined together are at least 80% of the plots that have been foiled. So vigilance expressed by individuals, vigilance as practiced by trained first responders and law enforcement makes a huge difference. But for us to be informed means that we also need to engage in regular discussion as a community, as a concerned nation, to discuss and know about what are the recruiting tactics that are being used. And to know that our adversaries are increasingly relying on glossy English-speaking magazines, appeals via social media, even hip-hop videos, if you can imagine that. And we have seen an increasing sophistication of threats from cyberspace, including using major news events or natural disasters to target unsuspecting users with scams and malicious code. So while a sense of awareness is important, we all have to be willing to keep moving, keep learning, and to do a bit more. We can learn more about the signs or indicators of potential criminal or terrorist acts, and to say something to the proper authorities. It was a street vendor, after all, who last year tipped off the police to the Times Square bombing attempt. In January, it was alert city workers in Spokane, Washington, who reported a suspicious backpack and thwarted what almost certainly would have been a deadly bombing along that city's MLK parade route. We can practice better cyber habits whenever we are online, but also make sure that our children are practicing safe cyber habits and that we are cognizant of what they are doing online. This is especially relevant in the wake of several major breaches and phishing attacks that recently targeted the American public. And we can all take the basic steps necessary to know how to deal with an emergency when it happens. There was a lot of experience these past few weeks with communication systems totally going out because of tornadoes. People couldn't call each other on their cell phones. There was no way to do it. They couldn't know whether a family member had survived or not survived. Those families who had reunification plans, who had thought through ahead of time where the children were supposed to go, where they would all congregate if something were to occur, were in good shape. The others had hours and in some cases days of worry trying to locate their loved ones. So those kinds of efforts, which sound so basic and that as almost to be too simple, but they're not. Why? Because what we're talking about is making sure that across this country, every single person is incorporating and understanding the role that they play. And that's a big challenge for us. We're used to, in many respects, not listening to these types of efforts, when in fact we need to be listening and empowering more. We are still a young department, but we're old enough to know what works and what doesn't work. And what we know really works is when people are not relying on one federal department to do all of the work and address all of the challenges. So finally, if I might, let me close with the notion that what I have suggested to you today about the evolving nature of the threat, you may have heard some about, although I'm not sure people in this auditorium perhaps recognize how quickly the threat is evolving, but nonetheless it's there. You perhaps have heard about some of these things we are doing, but perhaps have not put them into a total framework of steps that interact with each other to help us strengthen our Homeland Security architecture. And perhaps you have not really thought about the role that each of you plays. You know, for decades we have looked to civil defense and neighborhood watch programs to be elements of our own protection. We've accommodated to new threats as threats have changed. When we were in the midst of the Cold War, we all knew where the closest fallout shelter was, and we learned to hide under our desks. We learned to keep children indoors during polio epidemics. Some of these things work, some of them kind of sound silly in retrospect. But I got to tell you, right now, we need as a country to keep adapting, to think ahead, to be nimble and to be adaptive as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. We have made great strides, but even given that, we cannot provide guarantees. While all the things I've discussed with you today are steps forward, we will never put this country under kind of a glass dome and seal it against all threats, whatever the threat's origination. We know that we have to deal with risk. We have to maximize our ability to prevent something untoward from happening. We have to minimize the disruption that a successful attack could cause. We have to, on the one hand, be proactive and thoughtful, thinking always what could be around the next corner, and on the other hand, have confidence that we have built in our communities the ability to respond and to respond quickly, to come back, and to come back. And it's with that kind of confidence that we proceed. Our greatest source of strength and our greatest sense of security will always ultimately rest not with any machinery, not with any technology, not with any one federal department, but it's always going to, indeed, it's going to rest fundamentally on the citizens of our country. And we have to make sure they re-engage. They re-engage in the ways I have described, and perhaps others as well. And that will be a fitting way to commemorate the upcoming 10-year anniversary of 9/11. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna sit down now.
Napolitano, for your really thought-provoking remarks today. My name is Faiza Patel. I'm one of the co-directors of the Liberty and National Security Program here at the Brennan Center, and I'm going to moderate our question and answer session with the audience today. So just a few ground rules for people. We have 2 microphones, one on either end of the room, for people who want to ask questions, so please identify yourselves to the people holding the microphones. I understand that we have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions and answers, so please keep your questions short. And when you take the microphone, please do identify yourself so that we know who's speaking. So since I'm the moderator, I get to ask the first question. And I want to come back, Secretary, on something that you mentioned about the fusion centers and the suspicious activity reporting system, which, as I understand it, is a system by which we collect information at the state and local level and then funnel it in a way that it's useful to counterterrorism and other anti-crime efforts around the country. So my question to you is, how do we guarantee the quality of the information that's going into the system? And when we're collecting information, how do we guarantee that it isn't infected by biases that may occur with individuals? And finally, when you take information out of context, don't you lose something? And how do you account for that when you're talking about bringing this information back into the federal system?
Well, let me address that in 2 ways. One is From a law enforcement perspective, when we're talking about suspicious activity reporting, this is a discipline. I mean, there's a protocol. There's a protocol about what kind of information, how it is to be collected and handled at the local and state level, how it is to be forwarded. The protocol, there's a curricula to teach the protocol. So when I talked about the thousands of frontline law enforcement personnel who have been trained, they have been trained in accordance with the protocol, and we have a whole department within DHS on civil rights and civil liberties. They helped create the protocol, and we had it reviewed by outside groups who look with healthy suspicion at some of these kinds of things. We want to make sure that we are turning very square corners, and so that's one of the ways we do it. The second thing is that one of the real capacity building things we need to do across our country is get intelligence analytic capability out of Washington, D.C. and into the country. So that all data doesn't just flow into Washington, D.C., removed from its local context, removed from kind of local appreciation about what's going on. One of the first acts I did as secretary was to take intel analysts who are working in D.C. and move them out to work directly in the fusion centers themselves so that they could train others in analysis, but also so that we got a more organic sharing of information out in the fusion centers before it even got to Washington, D.C., or indeed came back. But if I might, let me just describe an example of how this works. And I'll use a real case. There's an individual named Zazi. He was from Colorado. He was driving across the country. He was building backpack bombs, or was with backpack bombs designed to attack the Long Island tunnels, right? And these bombs were hydrogen peroxide based. Well, that's a data point. That's intel. But how you turn it around and how you really turn it into information sharing is to share information about, well, what kind of bombs were they, what kind of power would they have, to suggest that local police departments survey any beauty product suppliers in their jurisdictions to see if they had seen any unusual sales, high quantity sales, et cetera, because we didn't know whether this was a plot that was a unitary plot or whether there were several others that were planned to go on around the same time. I hope that gives you some sense of what, from an info sharing aspect, we're trying to build here, which is to get information to Washington, but also to get information back.
Okay, well, I think we're ready for questions from the audience now, so.
My name is Charles Cromo. I am a tax attorney. I am a loyal supporter of the Obama administration, and I have a very short question. In a recent article in The New Yorker, Jane Mayer reported that under the Bush administration, there were enormous electronic storage facilities set up in Texas and Utah, basically to get copies of all emails transmitted in America. I'm quoting the article. Number one, would you happen to know if that's the truth, that the Bush administration was trying to collect all emails? Number two, if it was the truth, has the NSA under the Obama administration shut down these collection efforts, or in fact, are all our emails still being transmitted to some government agency? Thank you.
I can't comment to that statement because I don't know the answer, but I can tell you how we are interacting with the NSA. The cyber world has basically, if you look at cybersecurity, pursuant to President Obama's review, which he instituted at the beginning of the administration. Now, the issue was how to organize cybersecurity for the United States. As I mentioned, this is a rapidly evolving area, and there were things, all through the government. People had different responsibilities, different budget lines, and so forth. Under the review, the Department of Defense has responsibility for the .mil universe. DHS has the responsibility for the civilian side of government and for the intersection with the private sector, which in fact controls 85% of our nation's critical infrastructure. Now, we both need to use the NSA. We weren't going to build two different NSAs. It's a huge national asset, and it is really impossible of replication on any commonsensical basis. But what the Secretary of Defense and I did was to negotiate how each of us would use the technical resources of the NSA. And under our memoranda, the folks from the department who are at the NSA, and I have folks now at the NSA, have also with them people from our Office of Privacy, people from our Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and people from our Office of General Counsel, because we do not want the American people fearing that in our effort to protect the cyber world from attack for the things that are under our jurisdiction, our responsibilities, that in our efforts to do that, we are somehow going through and improperly reviewing, collecting, or retaining their personal data. Yeah.
Tamara Gitt, Fox News. Just a question, what are your thoughts on the rebuilding of the World Trade Center, and would that make it a bigger threat than it was before? And if so, what can the federal government do to work on security between the NYPD and the Port Authority?
Sorry, could you please identify yourself?
Sure, Tamara Gitt, Fox News.
Thank you.
Well, I think the decision to rebuild is a local decision. I think some of the leaders from the law enforcement and first responder community are here at the lecture this evening. I thank them for that. But I am very confident whatever decision made, that the people of New York and New York City are very well protected. There's a very impressive operation here.
Hi, I'm Bart Gelman from Time Magazine. I wanted to ask about another instance in which DHS is, I think, unambiguously collecting people's private and personal information, which is at borders with the searches and imaging of digital devices. DHS asserts the power to do that entirely under its own discretion without suspicion or explanation. As I understand it, you keep those images and have not said whether you destroy any of the data afterward, whether you share it. Can you explain the policy and why that isn't a dichotomy between security and liberty?
Well, the long-standing law has been that the powers of the government at the borders in determining what and who comes in are different than once you get into the country. The standard of proof, for example, for collecting evidence is lower at the borders. Once you're inside the country, that's a different issue. But the border issue, the border is different. And our authorities at the borders are very, very large. And we have huge authorities and huge responsibilities there as to what comes in the country and under what circumstances. That authority, it's old law, there's no new law being created here, was extended to laptops. And there have been, from a proportional basis, very, very small percentage, but a very infinitesimal percentage of laptops that have been seized at the border to look for things like, in some cases they have found planning literature, and some they have found pornography, child porn in particular. and the like. And then those are turned over to whomever the local U.S. attorney is for possible prosecution. There is a very, I think there is a public misconception that we are simply willy-nilly taking laptops and reading them for our own wishes, and that really isn't true. It's just the same authority we have to search, for example, somebody's backpack when they come into the country. And as I said earlier, those authorities are longstanding and have served us to good avail.
Hello. Hi, Secretary Napolitano. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Liza Goitein. I'm the other co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center. My question is, you spoke today about the importance of information sharing, and you also spoke about local and state law enforcement now being at the front lines of national security. One of the things that you hear if you follow these issues is that sometimes state and local law enforcement and first responders, other players on the state and local scene, have difficulty sometimes getting the information that they need to do their job because the classification system, the system for classifying documents at the federal level, which, as you know, has been the same system that's been in place since the Cold War, emphasizes compartmentalization, need-to-know restrictions, a lengthy and cumbersome process for getting clearances, and in various ways make it difficult for people to get the information they need on a timely basis, and that these problems are compounded by the fact that a lot of information that doesn't need to be classified is classified. Is that, how have you dealt with or experienced this issue, and what are some of your thoughts about potential solutions to make information sharing more effective and to deal with the issues that classification causes?
I agree. I think that we really need to be as transparent as we can, and we need to deal with classification in a way that facilitates information sharing, particularly on a real-time basis, on the kinds of things that we are dealing with on a regular basis. So I think you can address it a couple of ways. One is to look at the classification system itself, and we have been working with DOJ on just that, pursuant to a presidential directive. The second is to increase the number of people who are qualified to receive information at different and higher levels of classification. And so one of the efforts being made at the fusion centers, for example, is to increase the number of people there who can actually have access to classified information in their own right. And I think the third way to deal with it is to more quickly turn around products that can be shared at the FOUO level for purposes of kind of general threat information, contextual information, situational awareness. So, for example, the night bin Laden was killed, DHS and the FBI within a few hours had an FOUO product that was distributed throughout the country, followed up by a more classified product, of course, but something that could go out immediately. So I think those are, you know, kind of the three basic elements that we have to deal with.
Hello, my name is Jacob Goodwin. I'm the editor of a trade publication called Government Security News. I want to ask a question that has common sense sometimes bumping into political correctness. And I don't mean this to be an insensitive question, but I want to ask you a sharp question. You said earlier in your remarks that there's no single portrait of a would-be terrorist and that the administration has no interest in profiling, and that not only are those policies, the profiling policies, illegal, but they're also ineffective. common sense tells me that in most of the cases since 9/11 that we've made arrests, it wouldn't be profiling to discover that most of the suspects or the convicted parties have been men, typically under 30 or under 35, often Muslim. It's not, so my question is it, I guess my question is, how do you square what most people would say if they're just talking to you, that common sense would suggest those are appropriate parties to at least focus more attention on, given that those were the parties that most often are arrested? Not to say that all men under 35 who are Muslim are suspect, not at all. But I guess my question is, why wouldn't the department focus more of its attention on that category of individual who's turned up most often as the suspect?
Well, because you're not using good logic there. You've got to use actual intelligence that you receive. And so you might, all you've given me is kind of status. You haven't given me a technique, a tactic, a behavior, something that would suggest that somebody is not a Muslim, but is Islamist and is actually has moved into the category of violent extremist. Now, we have ways to make some of those cuts, and they involve the intel that comes in, the analysis that goes on. For example, we oftentimes for travelers entering the United States, we won't do what's called a secondary inspection just because they're a 35-year-old male who appears to be Muslim, whatever that means. But we know from intelligence that if they have a certain travel pattern over a certain period of time, that should cause us to ask some more significant questions than if they don't, and that's what secondary is all about. So we continue to focus ourselves and to focus those with whom we work and those we train, not on status issues, but on actual behaviors, tactics, and techniques that we can associate from intelligence that we know, or things we have learned, or other countries have learned, that could translate into possible criminal or terrorist activity.
So I think we have time for one more question. Maybe over here? Yeah. I think we have to keep it quick.
Thank you, Secretary. My name is Linda Sarsour. I'm with the National Network for Arab American Communities, and I have two very brief questions. The first question is, New York State just opted out of secure communities, and I would love to hear your thoughts about whether you believe that secure communities program really makes us more secure. And my second question to you is, about a month and a half ago, the Arab and Muslim American communities were very happy to hear that NCR suspended its program. The follow-up to that would be, what happens to the individuals who did register and have delayed applications now with the DHS? Is there some sort of mechanism that's in place to deal with those cases? Thank you.
Yes, to the second, and we'll talk with you afterwards so we can get you the information on that. With respect to secure communities, let me describe what it is for the audience. It's an information sharing agreement between us and the FBI that says when an inmate is being booked into a jail or prison and their fingerprints are taken, they are run not only against criminal databases, but against immigration databases. It is part of our effort on the immigration side of things to prioritize those in the country illegally who are also violating other criminal laws. And where do you logically find those persons first? Jails and prisons. And so we have seen statistically that boat is turning. That I think is it focuses the ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, where it needs to focus. I will simply say with respect to New York, there's been a lot of miscommunication and understanding about secure communities. I think we are and have to accept responsibility for that. But the plain fact of the matter is that this is a federal interoperability information sharing system. So the notion that individual states had to sign agreements to be in it or out of it was inaccurate.
Well, I think with that we'll end. Thank you very much, Secretary. And
Thank you all.